Good evening and welcome to the New York Symposium with Diane Sayre. I'm Diane Sayre, a LaRouche independent candidate for U.S. Senate in 2024. Today is April 7th. It is Good Friday. It is in Passover week and Ramadan. And I think in such a moment, it would be worthwhile for people to reflect on their relationship to humanity as a whole, to our Creator, and to our immortality. We are in an absolutely unbelievable situation where each of us alive today has the potential to change the future for perhaps centuries, or to not do what is necessary and to discover that we have no future because the bankrupt transatlantic Anglosphere, British Empire, World Economic Forum, whatever you want to call it, this NATO, UK, US conglomerate seems absolutely determined to push every boundary beyond the limit of what is bearable for Russia and now also China. I was slightly distracted at the beginning of this program because I just got an email from my congressman, Mike Lawler, who has been on a bipartisan tour of the Indo-Pacific and was speaking from Taiwan, where he and he's a Republican, and some of his Democratic colleagues who were there wanted to let everyone know that we are going to provide our absolute maximum support to Taiwan. Japan and South Korea, they also visited, are our great allies. Why is China viewed as an enemy? Now, meanwhile, you also have in Beijing Ursula von der Leyen of the European Commission. She is flirting with the idea of a disengagement or decoupling from China. But you also have Macron of France, who traveled to China with 50 CEOs of different companies. It may be the case, as likely is the case, that Europe is not unified on their policy. Some people at least know that just as the sanctions against Russia have not helped us in the West very much, launching more extreme trade wars and sanctions against China are not going to help us very much. And I wanted to share something from an economist and China expert who was interviewed by the Berliner Zeitung. His name is Dr. Wolfram Elsner, and he said, quote, "The West no longer thinks historically and no longer strategically, no longer than until the next election or the next victory in the war, and often much shorter. In East Asia, people think complexly, not linearly. To want to hammer our values into the head of a country like China with at least 5,000 years of high culture, philosophy, and science, to want to sell our solutions from perhaps 400 years of historical experience, as well as European Anglo-Saxon world domination and exploitation, as the completion and end of history, is not only oblivious to history, it is ridiculous." And I think that's very accurate. Now, I wanted to take up the topic of what's happening on the continent of Africa, because I think many Americans, while are somewhat aware that Russia has not been devastated by the sanctions, that new alliances are coming together, that you have nations of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Eurasian Economic Union. There are blocks of nations, very big nations, very populous nations, moving out of the dollar because, well, besides the fact the dollar is collapsing, you also cannot trust the United States. Afghanistan had $7 billion in the New York Federal Reserve, and we simply stole it. Said we didn't like their government and they couldn't have their money. Russia had 300 billion US dollars in currency reserves, and we froze that because we're putting them under sanctions. So you can imagine whether you would want to put your money in a bank, which was as likely to steal your money and give it to someone else as give it back to you. It's not really a viable investment. So the dollar is not going to be the global currency for long. Biden does not have the ability to press Saudi Arabia anymore on the price of petroleum. They've decided to decrease supply and raise the prices a little bit, which does help Russia. China organized an agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which is a huge breakthrough. And in fact, a delegation from Saudi Arabia will be visiting Yemen. So perhaps the horrific bloodshed and starvation going on in that nation is about to end. Now we get to the continent of Africa. These nations are on a course to complete self-transformation, and the colonial world, the old colonial powers don't like it. And what I wanted to do is just, as people may know, Kamala Harris was over there, I'm sure for no good cause. I'll show you a few clips from her visit. Maybe we should start with that, or maybe I'm just thinking the best order. Well, let me just show you one little video, which I found I was quite happy about. Let's see if I have it here. Not quite. Which is just something that's happening right now in Egypt, which is that first of all, they're moving their capital, Alexandria. They're building a whole new city, and they've contracted with Rosatom to build a large nuclear power complex with 4 reactors. And I'm just going to show you a teeny snip of this to give you a sense of it, and really consider what we are not building in the United States right now. So let's see here. Here we go.
Rosatom, the Russian nuclear energy company, has reached an agreement with Egyptian Minister of Electricity and Renewable Energy to commence production of the core catcher devices for Egypt's El Dabaa nuclear power plants units 1 and 2, which is the nation's first nuclear power plant. The Egyptian Nuclear Power Plants Authority owns the 4.8 gigawatts project, which will include 4 1.2 gigawatts Russian pressurized water reactor units. The total cost of the project is approximately $30 billion, 85% of which will be provided by the government of Russia and the remaining by its Egyptian counterpart through private investors. The first of the 3 1.2 gigawatts plants is slated to commence in 2026, with the...
So just think about that, $30 billion. We have sent almost 4 times that to Ukraine for nothing but destruction. And think about the transformative effect of all of this energy coming into Egypt and what that means, not only for powering industry, powering cities, but desalination, greening the desert. Russia is financing that largely, and Egypt also partly. So I hope this gives people a sense. What does the United States have to offer the world? What is Russia offering the world? And I'm going to show another clip here so you get a sense of what Kamala Harris thinks that she has to offer the world while she's there. And you can think about this when you know that Russia and Putin said a few years ago that Russia wanted to light up Africa to provide enough electricity for them to have a fully modern, advanced standard of living by building nuclear power plants and other kinds of power plants. China is working similarly on massive ports, dams, railroads, etc. And then you have Kamala Harris visiting. So I'm just going to show part of this, an interview I guess she did when she came back. Here we are.
So I think let's start with how or why did you decide to travel to the continent of Africa at this time?
So, first of all, let me thank both of you for being such a big part of the trip. I hope we can cover in this short time we all have together the layers of what that trip was and the nuances. That being said, so as Vice President of the United States, I have now traveled to many places around the world in my capacity as Vice President. I have, at this point, met with over 100 world leaders, be they presidents, prime ministers, chancellors, or kings. And in these meetings and in these travels, it is always with a sense of the responsibility that we have as the United States of America to be present, to be engaged with our allies, with our partners, with people with whom we have great interdependence and intersection in so many ways. And so I have traveled all over the world practically. And this trip to the continent of Africa was very much in line with that approach, but with an incredible sense of optimism about what is happening on the continent. The median age on the continent of Africa is 19. By 2050, 1 in 4 people occupying space on Mother Earth will be on the continent of Africa. Think about what that means in terms of the opportunity, in terms of the future, in terms of the obvious fact, I believe, as evidenced by the demographics I've just shared, which is that what happens on that continent will impact the entire globe. Not to mention what is the intertwined history that we have and share with the continent. Not to mention the...
Hold on. So, I'm sorry, but it actually should be cause to be optimistic, but she's over there to make sure that the full potential is never realized. And let's see here if I can get the next clip, because you will hear from her promises of what she's going to get money for. Hold on a second. I think I can do it this way. Here we go. Yeah.
Great. I want to talk a little bit about that very thing, the public-private partnerships. When I was there in Ghana and Accra, I got to go by David Ajayi's studio, Ajayi Associates, and of course, David Ajayi helped design this building. So it was wonderful to see him and what they're up to now, building hospitals across the country, doing all sorts of innovation, which reminded me of your speech at Black Star Plaza where you mentioned African innovation. But you didn't just speak about it. Later you announced $8 billion, that's billion with a B, of private and public investments to the continent. And you issued a call to action to the private sector. Why is this important, these next steps? What do you see down the road for this?
So there's a backstory to it, which partly is that early in our administration, I had a focus on what was happening around the northern part of Central America, Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, because of the irregular migration that we were seeing. And we created a public-private partnership that we ended up getting commitments over $4.2 billion for those 3 countries in that region. And as a result of that work, thank you. And so as a result of that work, already we have 4 million people online that had not been, 1 million people in the banking system that had not been. So I knew it works because we tried it and it worked. So it was always my intention, let's take that to the continent of Africa. So I literally got on the phone and called a bunch of the partners there and then more and said, hey, we're going to take this approach. We have a model that's worked. Many of them knew about it if they hadn't been a part of it. And 201, they said, count us in. So Microsoft, HP, Cisco, MasterCard, Visa, Ford Foundation, MacArthur Foundation, Melinda Gates all said yes. And so through this, we then got pulled together $8 billion, $7 billion, which is focused on climate. So that's resilience, adaptation, right? All that we need to do there, and $1 billion on the women's inclusion piece. And
so I hope you hear what she's saying. She had such a successful model in Guatemala, El Salvador, and countries south of the border, which is why all kinds of people are trying to leave their countries and escape to come here. That was so incredibly successful because she brought people who want to have electricity, running water, and food. She made sure they were online and they had credit cards and bank accounts. And now she's going to bring the same model to Africa, where she's raised $8 billion from companies that have no interest in the well-being of the population. And out of the $8 billion, $7 billion is going to be used to prevent them from having energy in the name of saving the climate. Now you can see why some African leaders and others might find this offensive. And I would just like to share a couple of clips here. Let's see here, which will make this point, I think, very nicely. The first one, I think, is from Ghana. Actually, the president of Ghana, who doesn't like being lectured on why Ghana should not work with China. So let's see if I got that right. Hold on a minute. I'll go to the, well, let's go right here. Okay.
No, there may be an obsession in America about Chinese activities on the continent, but there's no such obsession here. China is one of the many countries with whom Ghana is engaged in the world. Your country is one of them. Virtually all the countries of the world are friends of Ghana.
Okay. Now, let's see.
No, there may be an obsession in America.
I guess I have to go back. Now, I want to show you from Zambia, a friend of ours, Mr. Mbe, who has been on Schiller Institute conferences. He was less polite. That was the president of Ghana, by the way, speaking with Kamala Harris in the room. Here we go.
Country that has toppled so many governments in Africa, that has led so many coups in Africa and other parts of the world. A country that has killed so many of our leaders in Africa and other parts of the world. The killers of Patrice Lumumba, those who toppled Kwame Nkrumah, those who killed Nasser, those who killed Muammar Gaddafi, today are coming to teach us about democracy. A country that has been built on a brutal force, on enslavement of other human beings, on the humiliation of Africans, the exploitation of Africans, the plunder of Africa, today is coming to teach us about democracy. If you have no respect for the dignity of others, if you have no respect for the sovereignty of other countries, you cannot claim to be a champion of democracy.
Okay. So very sharply said, with one misconception, because our nation was not built on slavery. The British wanted to keep us a slave-owning country because that is very destructive and limiting to one's economy. But absolutely, the assassination of Lumumba. He said the people who were behind the assassination of Lumumba, the overthrow of Nkrumah, the murder of Nasser and Gaddafi, remember Hillary Clinton, are now coming to our nation to lecture us about democracy. No, thank you. But I will say some years ago, leaders would not have had the courage or ability to be so outspoken. The fact that there is a new power in the world, which comes from this collaboration of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, particularly Russia and China now working together, makes it possible for smaller nations who wanted to tell us to get lost and get out of their life and let them develop now to do so. They have another option. So with that, oh, and let me just say, we were going to have a guest here from South Africa who I think has not been able to join us because of the internet, which he warned us. Maybe Kamala Harris should get down there and make sure his internet is working. His name is Meshach Mathango, and he had told me a few things this morning when we spoke earlier, when he warned me he might not be able to get on. One is that there's been a big battle there over energy. The South African energy company, Eskom, that Biden wanted to basically force them to go almost entirely into so-called sustainable energy, windmills, solar panels, that kind of thing. They have refused to do so. Unfortunately, they're still going with 40%, but not 100%. And I think that's very significant. And then he also reported to me that in Botswana, they are moving to get the Anglo-Americans out of the diamond trade, which has been now up to 75% owned by foreign governments, foreign companies. That's going to be soon 50-50 and very shortly 25%. So you have a growing resistance in Africa, nations coming into their own, developing their independence, developing their sovereignty. Kamala Harris was there to do everything she could to put the brakes on it. And I wanted to introduce David Cherry, who has been working with Lyndon LaRouche on the development of Africa and other scientific matters for many years, and let him fill in some more of the gaps on this question. David.
Thank you,
please
Diane.
Go ahead with it.
Yes, can I be heard very well?
Yes, very well.
Okay. Yeah. So what we've seen already from Diane's video clips is a degree of resistance in Africa, and I'd like to actually expand on that a bit. But first of all, what is the problem that Africa is facing today in terms of the colonial powers? That problem starts outside of Africa, and it has to do with the environmental hoaxes, and several years ago, the big boys, the people you see, for example, at the World Economic Forum, decided that they were going to divert huge amounts of investments into electric vehicles, and then compel most of the world, if they could, to convert to electrical vehicles. I'm not going to argue the merits and demerits of electrical vehicles. I'll just say that they're not a step forward. At the very best, they're a step sideways, but I think it really comes down to a step backward. And so this is a scam like the windmills. So if they're going to do this, this means you're building vehicles that are each of which is carrying around a huge, huge battery. It may weigh 1,000 pounds or may weigh 500 pounds. That's the kind of the range. And to make those batteries was going to require many, many times increase in the extraction of minerals such as lithium and cobalt and copper, and the list is longer than that. And much of that is to be gotten from Africa, where governments are relatively weak. And so the big companies are thinking that are telling the African governments that we want to. Of course, this is all for your good because we have to deal with the climate. But to do that good, we need a free hand. We don't want regulation. We don't want regulation of labor forces. We want to be able to go into your countries, do the mining in whatever way we see fit, and then trade with you on terms that are favorable to us, not to you. That's what it comes down to. That's what it's always been, really. So in 2018, one of the big four consulting companies, Deloitte, wrote a paper for the World Economic Forum, which they're partnered with on this subject. That was very hard to understand because they were inventing a new terminology that was designed to conceal what they were really saying. But you can, if you read it 3 times, you'll figure it out. So then when one sees Kamala Harris going to Africa and talking about the things she's talking about, and raising people's hackles by talking about LGBTQ and so forth and so on. What is that for? You're trying to create divisions within African countries that may be useful to destabilize governments and make it easier for the Anglo-American powers to get what they're after. So then when we look at the resistance that Diane has shown, and I'm going to show you, it's not adequately focused on this mega project that they're being faced with, and I think that's something that one needs to emphasize in the analysis of the situation in Africa today. Well, if Africans do not fully understand that yet, I mean, they do in places and in part, certainly. But how is it that there's this resistance is showing up? Why? It's because of the combined power of Russia and China. I don't mean just raw power. I mean the economic power, especially, and this gives the African governments freedom of. Then they're not locked in merely to the Anglo-American powers and their allies. Okay, so I want to show you some video clips, and the first 3 are showing the same person, one person, Dr. Naledi Pandor. She is the Minister of International Affairs and Cooperation in South Africa, and she gets the spotlight because what she has to say is not just a form of defiance. She's very thoughtful, and she is in a way, she is the ambassador for Africa as a whole. So anyhow, may we have the first clip, please? Here she is speaking at the Council on Foreign Relations. I don't have a date for it.
You know, I think this notion of international rules is very comfortable for some people to use when it suits them, but they don't believe in international rules when it doesn't suit them, because they don't apply international rules or law equally in all circumstances. So you can't say because Ukraine has been invaded that suddenly sovereignty is important, but it was never important for Palestine. It's very peculiar. If you believe in international law truly, then wherever sovereignty is infringed, it must apply. And this is the point we've been making, that we use the framework of international law unequally, depending on who is affected. And we are arguing that that must change. And one of the interesting changes that has occurred is the sudden movement, because Russia has invaded Ukraine, that we say, okay, let's not allow the Security Council to just have the veto and let it pass. We take it to the General Assembly. When some of us had been calling for the General Assembly to have a greater say, we never enjoyed support. But suddenly today, see, that's where international law begins to mean nothing. Because for some, we see it as a cheating, and for others, we see it as a benefit. So our argument is, let's revise the international multilateral system to ensure that we observe that post-1948 has arrived.
The next one is Dr. Pandor speaking at a press conference with U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken in South Africa at the end of last year. And this clip comes from the African Diaspora News Channel, African Diaspora News Channel on YouTube. Go ahead.
In Kenya.
South Africa minister accuses the West of bullying African nations. South Africa Minister of International Relations Naledi Pandor accused the West of sometimes taking a patronizing and bullying attitude towards Africa as she hosted the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken on the first leg of his Africa visit.
But in terms of our interaction with some of our partners in Europe and elsewhere, there has been a sense of a patronizing bullying toward you choose this or else. And the recent legislation passed in the United States of America by the House of Representatives, we found a most unfortunate bill that we'd hope the media would say more about, because when we believe in freedom, as I'm saying, it's freedom for everybody. You can't say because Africa is doing this, you will then be punished by the United States. So that's been a disappointing passage of legislation by one house, and we hope the other house will not agree to such offensive legislation. So indeed, it is important that all of us accept our ability to hold different opinions. We are, after all, sovereign nations that are regarded as equal in terms of the United Nations Charter. We may differ in terms of economic power and economic ability to influence development in different parts of the world, but what will make the world work is if we respect each other. This is very, very important. And one thing I definitely dislike is being told either you choose this or else. When a minister speaks to me like that, which Secretary Blinken has never done, but some have, I definitely will not be bullied in that way, nor would I expect any other African country worth its salt to agree to be treated.
Honestly, more power to her. She said this in front of his face, not when he left the country in front of his face during their meeting. So we love to see it, and she made it very clear, and I love that. Most, like back in the days, it used to be like whenever they come, especially, you know, any representative from the West, the US, the UK, EU, whatever, they will pull up the red carpet. Our leaders will pull up a red carpet and just act like their saviors, their kings and queens came to the motherland. Like, that's how they act. But nowadays, that's not how it's going, and we just love to see it. So the South Africa minister, she clearly told him, we're not on the same page when it comes to Ukraine, when it comes to China, when it comes to Palestine. Like, we have our own minds and we have our own decisions to make, and you are not in charge of that. And I love that. So she basically told them that we're not gonna allow you to dictate how we feel or what we choose to do with our votes and what we choose to do when it comes to our relationship with the outside world.
When Dr. Pandor speaks this way, it resonates all over Africa, and you can hear, you know, the kind of the rising of the voices in harmony with hers. It wasn't completely obvious from that video, but she was sitting at a desk facing the audience, and beyond her was Anthony Blinken. So this next video is I think from the same South African Broadcasting Corporation, the state broadcaster in South Africa.
Seek to teach a country that, you know, instability has supported opposition groups against liberation fighters and so on. You know the history perhaps better than myself. This is a reality. So in my view, while there may be concern about Wagner Group or Van Dijk, which is another security group which was in Mozambique, there's also a concern about countries that have mineral interests in African countries and are there as a destabilizing force. So I think we need to look at the full plethora of problems that give rise to insecurity, bad governance, and the absence of democracy on the Africa's rich mineral wealth, Africa at heart.
Okay, so then we move to the president of Uganda, Yoweri Museveni, and this again is from this one is from the Make Africa Group.
The Western countries should stop wasting the time of
practices.
Europeans and other groups marry cousins and near relatives. Here to marry within the clan is taboo, home zero. Should we impose sanctions on them for marrying relatives? So we should put sanctions on people who are marrying their cousins in other parts of the world. This is not our job. If they are marrying their cousins, that's their problem.
United States of America says it may impose sanctions on.
Going to be able to include the president of Namibia taking exception to the remarks of a German diplomat in public, but this last one is the president of the Democratic Republic of Congo, Tshisekedi, interrupting the president of France, Macron, and contradicting him. And this is from the African diaspora.
African countries, and one of those countries was Democratic Republic of Congo. He had a press conference with the president, President Felix, and they had a heated exchange. Let me show you this clip, we'll come back and discuss.
Quand un ou une journaliste française pose une question, ça n'est pas le gouvernement de la France. Et c'est bien comme ça. Mais il ne faut pas tout confondre. Parce que, non, mais c'est pas une position de la France. Je faisais allusion. Parce qu'il n'y a pas de, il y en a eu.
Je faisais allusion au propos de Le Drian. Lui, il est officiel français.
Oui, mais
le compromis à l'africaine, c'est Le Drian, c'est pas la journaliste.
C'est exact, mais ce compromis. Mais cette formule, Président.
President Felix said, "Not on my watch. You are not gonna lie on us when I am standing here and breathing." He stopped him when he tried to insinuate, if reporters are asking you the questions, it has nothing to do with the French government. Really? No. That's a blatant lie, because your own ministers say those things. Your own ministers degrade African countries. Your own ministers make statements. So no, your ministers represent the French government. Hence, French government is accountable for the things that are being said. So he was rightfully called out. And if you have noticed, President is no longer a dictatorship. The Democratic Republic of Congo leader stopped him when he tried to deny. The Central African Republic leader also called out the Western governments just recently. So it's really wonderful to see our leaders finally standing up and speaking up.
I think I don't need to make any additional comments.
Great. Well, thank you. So I just would like to say a few things that I think should be obvious, but what Americans may not consider is that it's obvious to the rest of the world. One is that we just had a former president of the United States indicted by the state of New York for supposedly on a federal campaign money infringement for hush money to a prostitute. It's completely absurd. And this is going on while the entire world knows that President Biden personally was involved in the decision to blow up the Nord Stream pipelines, the greatest infrastructure sabotage on the planet. And there is not to be any investigation of this. No one is being held accountable. The Russians demanded, they didn't point fingers, they just said we'd like an investigation in the UN. And as Ambassador Nebenzia, the Russian ambassador to the United Nations, has said repeatedly that he knows when there's a vote, only Brazil, China, and Russia voted to even investigate what happened to the Nord Stream pipelines. He said that people get threatened. They get messages. We know where your children are going to school in New York. We know where your bank account is. That's why the intelligence agencies, the treasonous wing of the United States, so-called deep state loyal to the British Empire, gets votes the way that they want. But this is completely absurd. So you have an indictment against the former president who is currently has declared his candidacy for the presidency. It's obvious to the entire world that this has nothing to do with concern about a crime and has everything to do with controlling the outcome of the next election. They spent $200 million and brought in 38,000 policemen to New York City for this, while we have public housing that simply cannot get any repairs. And I will add that the US Congress similarly has failed to investigate what happened with Nord Stream and why they were not informed. If Seymour Hersh's article is true, and he has a very, very good track record, why were they not informed about this? So the hypocrisy is obvious to the world. We heard it from the foreign minister of South Africa. What do you mean by rules-based order? Suddenly sovereignty matters when it's Ukraine. It didn't matter if it's the Palestinian people. It doesn't matter if it's Iraq or Syria or Somalia. The world didn't shut down all American participation in the Olympics and ban all American musicians from participating in international music festivals when we invaded Iraq and killed over 1 million people. So it's worth thinking about that. And the point that I've been making is whether you think you have power to change this or not in the United States. The world is holding you and me accountable. We are citizens in a republic. We are accountable. We are responsible for what our government does. And I would like to just say, and David, you may have more, but I wanted to just share something here, which is very important. Coming up on April 15th and 16th, the Schiller Institute will be holding an international conference. Without the development of all nations, there can be no lasting peace for the planet. This is the invitation. I will be speaking at this conference on the second panel. The first panel will be keynoted by Helga Zepp-LaRouche. People that you are familiar with, like Scott Ritter and other military experts, will be speaking on the growing danger of World War III. That's 9 a.m. on Saturday morning. And then at 1 p.m. on Saturday afternoon is the unity of the global majority and the international peace movement. What we've seen in the United States and in Western Europe of diverse groups putting aside their differences to stop the war drive is very resonant with what you see from these African leaders and others. Sunday morning at 9 a.m., End the Casino Economy Before It's Too Late, which will be taking up the question of the financial blowout, the bankruptcy of the transatlantic system, which is well known to the world, maybe not to your stockbroker, or they're trying to keep you from knowing it, but that's the case. And then finally, Sunday afternoon, the necessary philosophical foundations for the new paradigm. We'll have Helga Zepp-LaRouche again, and that will be followed by a concert at 4 p.m. In New York City. If you're in New York City, you can get tickets to go to the concert, and otherwise you can, I think it's $5 if you want to listen online. And that is the Schiller Institute NYC Chorus, which I founded actually in, it's almost their 10-year anniversary. Isn't that amazing? 2014. Doing selections from Handel's Messiah predominantly, and a couple of Negro spirituals. So please clear your schedule for the 15th and 16th of April. And then the following weekend on the 22nd, I will be holding a major campaign event in New York City. The moderator will be Tara Reid. Jose Vega, our intrepid intervener, who is doing the AV for this show right now, will be speaking. Dennis Speed, Scott Ritter, and others. And we'll also have some wonderful music there. So I hope you can register for that. But David, anything else that you would like to say to our audience?
It's worth considering the connection between what I've spoken about concerning the plan to extract all these minerals from Africa on the one side, and the question of war or peace on the other. If Africa will not allow the Western powers or anybody else to go in there and do as they wish, it helps to shift the balance away from this one world dictatorship that they're trying to impose. I think it has a tendency to favor peace. I mean, I'm talking about a tendency to avoid the World War III. That's a thought. I have not taken it further yet, but maybe I will.
Well, that's certainly important. So I think we can wrap up for this evening. I am sorry, but this is the state of affairs, that our guests could not be with us. We're going to have to continue to encourage the Russian and Chinese commitment to help Africa electrify itself. And I say that advisedly because people who've watched the Schiller Institute conference know that there are many, perhaps soon thousands and hundreds of thousands of young aspiring engineers and scientists in many of these African nations. And if we would just stop the insanity of the West, they would be able to develop. And I think we should reflect on the situation in the United States, what the standard of living was in the United States in the 1960s, a time when one person working 40 hours a week could sustain a family with children, take a vacation. Their children could get a decent education. You had decent health care. You had water, clean drinking water, adequate food, and the situation today. So the change has to be made here. And again, it is incumbent on the American people to stand up and make yourself known to your congressman. It is not hopeless. They can be changed. And the greatest ally we have right now is reality. So thank you, David, for joining me. And thank you, everyone. And hopefully we'll see you next Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, and then in New York City on the 22nd.
And we will get Meshach onto one of our programs soon.
Yes, absolutely.
He wanted very much to be here today.
Yep. And he did warn us about the internet there. So
yeah.